The Galactic Assembly Hall stretched 3 kilometers across, its dome showing the stars beyond. 47 different species gathered in their designated sections, their various forms of communication filling the space with sound and light. Ambassador Minseo Park stood in the human section, reviewing her notes one final time. She had done this hundreds of times before. The monthly report, the careful summary of disputes resolved, conflicts prevented, and agreements reached. For 80 years, humanity had served this role. They were not the strongest species. They were not the smartest or the fastest. But they could listen. They could understand. They could find the words that brought enemies to the same table. Minseo had trained for this role since childhood, like her mother before her, and her grandmother before that. 12 generations of human diplomats had built this reputation, word by careful word. Every major empire in the galaxy now depended on human mediators when problems arose. The session began with standard reports, trade agreements, scientific collaborations, resource allocations. Then came the disputes. The Krethian Dominion representative stood first, its 4 arms gesturing in the formal pattern of grievance. The translator rendered its clicks and whistles into common language. The Velcor Confederacy has violated our territorial boundaries in the threshold systems. We demand immediate mediation. The Velcor representative rose, its crystalline form refracting the chamber lights. The Krethians make false claims. Those systems contain minerals vital to our survival. We also request human mediation to resolve this matter fairly. Both sides turned to the human section. This was normal. This was expected. Humans always mediated. Humans always found the solution. Minseo stood. The chamber fell silent, as it always did when humans prepared to speak. She felt the weight of those 80 years pressing down on her shoulders. She thought of the files she had reviewed last night, the secret reports, the patterns that had emerged. She opened her mouth and said, "Humanity respectfully declines to mediate this dispute." Then she sat down. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of shock, of confusion, of something fundamental breaking. The Krethian representative made a sound the translator could not process. The Velcor emissary's light patterns flickered in what might have been disbelief. Across the chamber, representatives from 47 civilizations tried to understand what they had just heard. Elder Yun Ji-won, the senior human diplomat, stood briefly. His weathered face showed nothing. "We have nothing further to add at this time," he said quietly, and sat. The chamber erupted, not in violence, but in noise. Questions in 20 languages, demands for explanation, appeals to tradition and precedent. The session moderator, a being whose species had existed for 3,000 years, struggled to restore order. Through it all, the human delegation sat in complete silence. Their faces were calm. They answered no questions. They acknowledged no demands. They simply existed in their seats, present, but offering nothing. After 2 hours, the session adjourned. No resolution had been reached. For the first time in living memory, a dispute brought before the assembly had been left untouched. Minseo returned to her quarters and immediately began receiving messages, hundreds of them, from embassies, from trading partners, from species she had helped in the past, all asking the same question, why? She answered none of them. Across the galaxy, news of the refusal spread through FTL communication networks. On 47 homeworlds, advisors briefed their leaders. On trade stations and colony worlds, people gathered to discuss what this meant. The galactic markets responded first. Uncertainty drove values down. Stocks in mining operations near disputed zones dropped sharply. Insurance rates for shipping through contested space increased overnight. Military contractors saw their values rise as governments began considering options they had not needed to consider in decades. In the Krethian military headquarters, generals gathered around projection tables. They had mobilization plans, of course. Every empire did, but those plans had been theoretical for so long. No one had actually expected to use them. In the Velcor capital, the Council of Shards convened an emergency session. They had 6 warships in reserve near the threshold systems. Should they move them forward? What if the Krethians interpreted that as aggression? In the past, they would have asked a human mediator to help craft the right message. Now there was only silence. Across the galaxy, 6 other simmering disputes suddenly had no mediators available. Species that had been preparing to request human intervention found themselves staring at empty communication channels. In a small office on Earth, junior diplomat Lee Hyunwoo sat with 3 months of data spread across multiple screens. He was the one who had first noticed the pattern, the one who had brought it to Ambassador Park's attention. The data was clear. In 23 cases over the past 5 years, agreements mediated by humans had been quietly violated. Not dramatically, not obviously, but consistently. The Krethians and Velcors had both signed a mining rights agreement 18 months ago. Satellite data showed both sides had been secretly mining the disputed zones ever since. They had used the peace to buy time. They had used human mediation as political theater while preparing their actual positions. And they were not alone. 23 violations in 67 mediated disputes, nearly 1 in 3. The numbers had gotten worse each year. Hyunwoo closed his eyes and remembered the debate among the senior diplomats. 15 people in a sealed room, discussing whether humanity's greatest contribution to galactic peace had become a tool for deception. Elder Yoon had spoken with quiet intensity. We taught them our words but not our values. They learned to speak peace without meaning it. Ambassador Park had made the final argument. Our voice has become a tool for those who do not want peace, only the appearance of it. Perhaps our silence will teach what our words could not. The vote had been unanimous. Now, 48 hours after the refusal, Hyunwoo watched the news feeds, conflicts erupting, markets falling, species panicking. He wondered if they had made the right choice. On her private terminal, Minseo Park opened a document she had been composing for 3 weeks. It was a message explaining everything: the violations, the patterns, the decision, the hope. But the message had conditions attached to it. It would only be sent when those conditions were met, when the galaxy showed it was ready to hear the truth behind the silence. She saved the document and closed the terminal. Somewhere in the assembly hall, maintenance crews cleaned the empty chamber. They had worked there for decades. They had seen countless disputes resolved in those seats. They had watched humanity bring peace again and again. None of them could remember the last time humanity had refused to speak. Most were not sure it had ever happened before. The cleaning crews finished their work and left. The great chamber sat empty, waiting for answers that would not come easily this time. 72 hours after the refusal, the Krethian Dominion moved 6 heavy cruisers toward the threshold systems. The Velcor Confederacy responded by positioning their crystal ships along the disputed border. Neither side fired, but weapons were charged and ready. Both sides sent urgent messages to human embassies. Both sides offered concessions, threatened consequences, and demanded explanations. The humans accepted the messages and filed them without response. In the Galactic Assembly, an emergency session convened. Representatives from 30 species stood to speak, all asking variations of the same question. Where were the humans? Why this silence? What did they want? The human delegation attended. Ambassador Park sat in her designated seat, her hands folded, her expression neutral. Elder Yoon sat beside her. Behind them, 12 other human diplomats maintained the same careful composure. For 6 hours, the assembly debated. Some species were angry, claiming humanity had abandoned its responsibilities. Others were confused, searching for explanations in past agreements. A few were frightened, watching conflicts grow without the safety net they had relied upon for 8 decades. Through it all, the humans sat in silence. They did not speak. They did not vote. When the moderator called upon them directly, Elder Yoon simply shook his head. No words, no explanation, just silence. The session ended with nothing resolved. The Krethian and Velcor delegations were forced to address each other directly for the first time in years. The conversation lasted 7 minutes before both sides walked away in frustration. On Earth, in the diplomatic compound, Ambassador Park reviewed the latest intelligence reports. 14 standard days had passed since the refusal. 4 separate conflicts had erupted across the galaxy. Small clashes, mostly. Patrols encountering each other in disputed zones. Warning shots fired. 3 ships damaged. 47 casualties. The numbers were small compared to the ancient wars, before humans joined galactic society, but they were growing. And they were happening because humanity had chosen silence. Park's assistant, Choi Sang-woo, entered her office. Ambassador, the Velcor Confederacy has sent a private delegation to Earth. They're requesting a confidential meeting. Park nodded. Let them come. The Velcor delegation arrived at midnight when the compound was quiet. 3 representatives, their crystalline forms dimmed to show respect. They were led to a simple meeting room where Ambassador Park waited alone. The senior Velcor spoke first, its light patterns forming words in the human visual spectrum. We come offering tribute, technology, territory, access to resources in 20 systems. We ask only for private mediation of the threshold dispute. Park listened. She had learned long ago that listening was the first requirement of diplomacy. When the Velcor finished, she spoke carefully. We hear your offer. We acknowledge your distress, but our answer remains unchanged. Why? The Velcor representative's light flickered with what might have been desperation. We have never offended humanity. We have honored all past agreements. Park pulled up a holographic display. Have you? The data showed satellite imagery of the threshold systems from 18 months ago. The mining agreement both sides had signed, mediated by humanity. And then the quiet violations. Secret Velcor operations in zones designated as neutral. Hidden mining installations disguised as research stations. The Velcor delegation dimmed further. Silence filled the room, but it was a different silence than before. Finally, Park spoke. We are listening to your actions, not your words. We find them insufficient. The Velcor left without another word. By day 16, humanity's silence had created a crisis no one had anticipated. Species that had relied on human mediation for decades suddenly had to negotiate directly with old rivals. The results were chaotic. The Krethians and Velcors held a direct meeting aboard a neutral station. Both sides brought military escorts. Both sides brought historical grievances dating back centuries. The meeting lasted 4 hours and produced only a single agreement: to establish a direct military hotline to prevent accidental escalation. It was not peace, but it was something they had achieved themselves, without human intermediaries. Elsewhere, the results were worse. 2 species in the outer rim sectors began a shooting war over water rights. Neither side knew how to negotiate without human translators who understood not just language, but cultural context. Stations were damaged. 15,000 people fled their homes. The galactic economy continued to destabilize. Trade routes that crossed disputed territories saw shipping volumes drop by 40%. Insurance companies either raised their rates or refused coverage entirely. Some colonies began rationing food and medicine, uncertain if supply lines would hold. And still, humanity said nothing. Human commercial ships continued their routes, but crews refused all political conversation. Human scientists at collaborative research stations worked in pointed, professional silence. They performed their jobs but offered no casual discussions about politics or current events. One frustrated Krethian scientist finally confronted his human colleague. "Do you hate us now?" The human, Dr. Kim Soo-jin, looked up from her work. "No, we do not hate you." "Then why?" "Because," Kim said quietly, "we realized we were helping you lie to yourselves and to each other, and we will not do that anymore." On day 21, the first major battle occurred. In the Threshold systems, Krethian and Velcor forces engaged in a 4-hour firefight. 3 ships were destroyed. 217 people died. Both sides immediately blamed each other. Both sides demanded human intervention to stop the violence. The human response came not from the diplomats, but from the Office of Public Information, a simple statement released to all galactic news networks. "Humanity grieves every life lost to violence. We remain committed to peace. We remain committed to dialogue. We remain committed to truth. When those who seek our help share that final commitment, we will speak again." The statement was analyzed by experts across 47 worlds. They debated every word, searching for hidden meanings and conditions. But the message was actually quite simple. Humanity wanted truth before dialogue. The problem was that most empires had built their diplomatic strategies on careful deceptions and strategic ambiguities. Truth was dangerous. In the Krethian capital, a young military officer named Ren watched the casualty reports from the Threshold battle. He had lost friends in that fight, and he knew, though he had never spoken it aloud, that the Krethians had violated the 18-month-old agreement. He knew the humans knew. Everyone in the military command structure knew. They had simply assumed the humans would never call them on it. Humans were mediators, not judges. They helped find solutions. They did not punish violations. Except now they had stopped helping, and the price of those old deceptions was being paid in blood. Ren stared at his terminal for a long time. Then he began typing a message that would change everything. On Earth, Ambassador Park received an alert, an encrypted message from an unknown source within the Krethian military. She opened it carefully, aware that it might be a trap or a trick. What she found was a confession, a detailed account of systematic violations of the mining agreement, classified documents, proof of what humanity already knew but had never been shown willingly, and a question: how do we fix this? Park sat back in her chair. It was not enough. One honest officer did not represent a shift in imperial policy, but it was a beginning. She sent a brief response. "Tell your truth publicly. Show your people what was done in their name. Then we can discuss what comes next." The response came quickly. "That could destroy my career." Park's final message was simple. "Yes, that is what accountability costs." She did not know if the officer would have that courage, but for the first time since the refusal began, she felt a small seed of hope. 3 months before the refusal, junior diplomat Lee Hyun-woo sat in his small office reviewing routine compliance reports. It was tedious work, the kind usually assigned to diplomats fresh out of training. He was checking whether species were following through on agreements humanity had mediated. Most were. The data showed trade flowing, borders respected, collaborative projects proceeding. But one file showed an anomaly. The Krethian Velcor mining agreement from 18 months prior. The agreement had created neutral zones, shared mining operations, and fair distribution of profits. Ambassador Park herself had mediated that dispute, and both sides had praised the human solution. But Hyun-woo's satellite data showed something different. Small mining installations in the neutral zones, operations disguised as research stations or monitoring posts. Both sides had them. Both sides were violating the agreement they had celebrated. He ran the analysis 3 more times, checking for errors. The data was solid. He brought it to his supervisor, Diplomat Choi Sang-woo. Choi studied the information carefully. Have you checked other agreements? I'm starting to. Sir, should we report this violation? Choi was quiet for a moment. Not yet. Let's see if this is an isolated case or a pattern. Be thorough, Hyun-woo, but be quiet about it. Over the next 6 weeks, Hyun-woo worked late into every night. He reviewed 5 years of mediated agreements, cross-referencing them with satellite imagery, trade data, military movements, and public statements. The pattern that emerged made his stomach turn. 23 agreements out of 67 had been systematically violated. Not all violations were equal. Some were minor border adjustments, others were significant resource theft, but all shared one quality: the violations had been concealed through diplomatic language and technical loopholes. The species involved were using human mediation as political theater. They would bring disputes to humans, accept the mediated solutions, praise humanity's wisdom, and then quietly do whatever they had planned to do anyway. The human-mediated agreements gave them time, gave them cover, and gave them the appearance of good faith while they pursued their actual goals. Hyun-woo brought his complete findings to Ambassador Park. She read through everything in silence. When she finished, she looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. Good work, Diplomat Lee. This stays between us for now. I need to think about what this means. 2 weeks later, the secret meeting took place. All 15 senior human diplomats gathered in a sealed room in the Earth diplomatic compound. Ambassador Park presented Hyun-woo's findings without commentary. Then she opened the floor for discussion. The debate lasted for 6 hours. Some argued that violations were to be expected, that imperfect peace was better than war. Others pointed out that humanity's role was being corrupted, turned into a tool that enabled deception rather than preventing it. Elder Yoon Ji-won spoke last. He was the oldest diplomat present, nearly 80 years old, and he had mediated more disputes than anyone alive. I have spent my entire life speaking for peace, he said quietly. I taught my children the words. I taught my students the methods, and I believed that our words mattered, that our efforts created genuine understanding between species. He gestured at the data. This shows me I was naive. We did not create understanding. We created a comfortable lie. Species learned to speak our language of peace without meaning it. They learned to perform reconciliation while planning betrayal. He looked around the room. We taught them our words, but not our values. And now our words enable the very conflicts we tried to prevent. When mediation becomes theater, mediators become accomplices. The silence that followed was heavy. Ambassador Park spoke carefully. What do you propose, Elder? I propose we stop speaking, completely, immediately. We withdraw all mediation services. We attend no disputes. We offer no solutions. We force the galaxy to face the consequences of their dishonesty. They will suffer, someone pointed out. There will be conflicts. There will be casualties. Yes, Yoon agreed, but those casualties will be the price of truth. And perhaps finally they will learn that peace without honesty is just postponed war. Ambassador Park called for a vote. It was unanimous. The Strategic Silence Protocol would begin at the next assembly session. Now, 17 days after the refusal, the galaxy was learning that lesson in blood. The Threshold Systems conflict had escalated from skirmishes to full battles. 50,000 people were dead. Stations had been destroyed. Both the Krethians and Velcors were bleeding resources and lives. But something unexpected was happening. Without human mediators, species were being forced to actually speak to each other. The conversations were awkward, hostile, and prone to breakdown. But they were real. The Krethian and Velcor military commanders established a direct communication channel, not for peace negotiations, but simply to prevent accidental escalations. They agreed on signals to indicate when ships were on patrol versus when they were preparing to attack. They established neutral zones where damaged ships could retreat without being fired upon. These were small steps, tiny compared to the comprehensive agreements humans had mediated in the past, but they were genuine. Both sides were negotiating because they needed to, not because it looked good politically. In the Outer Rim, two species fighting over water rights managed to reach a temporary ceasefire. The agreement was crude, full of loopholes, and would probably need revision, but they had done it themselves through painful direct negotiation. In her office on Earth, Ambassador Park watched these developments carefully. She maintained detailed records of every conflict, every negotiation attempt, every small success and failure. She was looking for signs, not signs of peace necessarily, but signs of authenticity. Signs that species were engaging with each other honestly rather than performing for human mediators. Some signs were positive, some were not. 3 conflicts showed no movement toward resolution. Leaders were digging into positions, unwilling to negotiate directly because they lacked the skills. Park opened her private log and recorded her thoughts. Day 17. The galaxy is in pain. That pain is teaching them what 8 decades of our words could not. They are learning that they must speak to each other as if we do not exist. Only then will they mean what they say. She paused, then added, "But how long do we maintain this silence? How many must die before the lesson is learned? These are questions I cannot answer alone." On day 23, the young Krethian officer, Ren, made his decision. He encrypted his evidence of violations and sent it not to humanity, but to the galactic news networks. Within hours, the story exploded across every major media outlet. Classified documents showing systematic violations of the mining agreement. Evidence that Krethian leadership had used human-mediated peace as cover for illegal operations. The scandal reached the highest levels of government. But Ren did something else, too. He included evidence of Velcor violations alongside the Krethian data. He exposed both sides equally. The Velcor government, faced with their own documented deceptions being revealed, could not simply blame the Krethians. Their own leaders had to answer for their actions. Across the galaxy, similar revelations began emerging. The 23 violated agreements that Hyun Woo had documented became public knowledge. Species that had violated human-mediated treaties scrambled to deflect blame and manage the political fallout. But public opinion was shifting. On Krethian worlds, protesters gathered demanding accountability from their leadership. On Velcor stations, citizens questioned why their government had dishonored agreements. Similar movements emerged on a dozen other worlds. A phrase began appearing in multiple languages across the galactic networks. We broke faith first. It was not universal. Many still blamed humanity for abandoning its role. But the conversation was changing. On day 28, Ambassador Park released a statement. It was brief, less than 200 words, but it was the first official human communication since the refusal. Humanity withdrew not in anger but in clarity. We cannot build peace for those unwilling to honor it. We do not judge you for being imperfect. We judge ourselves for enabling deception to masquerade as diplomacy. When you are ready to speak truth rather than convenience, we will listen. Until then, we trust you to find your own path forward. We believe you are capable of more than you have shown. Prove us right. The statement was watched by 40 billion beings across 47 worlds. In the Threshold systems, exhausted Krethian and Velcor commanders read those words and looked at the casualty reports from 30 days of fighting. Then they did something neither thought possible. They reached out to each other directly and asked, "Can we stop this?" Day 31 of the silence brought the breaking point. The Threshold Systems battle that day was the worst yet. Krethian and Velcor fleets met in the asteroid field where the richest mineral deposits lay. Both sides had committed their reserves. Both sides were fighting not just for resources now, but for pride, for honor, for the justification of all the blood already spilled. The battle lasted 7 hours. When it ended, 9 ships had been destroyed. 50,000 people were dead. Debris fields marked the graves of soldiers who would never go home. On both sides, the military commanders knew they could not sustain this. Resources were depleting. Public support was crumbling. But neither could afford to be the first to propose peace. That would look like weakness. In the Galactic Assembly, frustration reached a boiling point. An emergency session was called, and this time the target was not the disputed territories but humanity itself. The Krethian ambassador stood and spoke with barely controlled fury. Humanity claims to value peace, yet they watch us die and do nothing. They broke their responsibility to this assembly. We demand they resume mediation services immediately or face formal censure. 23 other species voiced agreement. The charges included abandonment of duty, negligent conduct causing harm, and failure to uphold galactic stability. The human delegation sat in their section, as they had for 31 days. Silent. Present, but offering nothing. The vote was called. Should humanity be formally censured for their refusal to mediate? The vote was 38 in favor, 6 opposed, 3 abstentions. The humans voted present. The censure passed. It meant nothing legally. Humans had violated no actual laws, but it was a statement of frustration, of anger, of species who had grown dependent on human services and now felt abandoned. Ambassador Park stood. For a moment, the entire assembly held its breath, hoping she would finally speak, finally explain, finally return to the role they needed her to fill. She bowed slightly to the assembly. Then she sat down without saying a word. The session dissolved into chaos. Representatives shouted accusations. Some demanded humanity be expelled from the assembly entirely. Others begged for reconsideration. The moderator lost control of the chamber for the first time in decades. Through it all, the humans remained silent. But that night, something changed. Ren, the young Krethian officer who had leaked the violation documents, appeared on the largest news network in the galaxy. He was still in uniform, though he knew it would likely be stripped from him soon. "I am Officer Ren of the Krethian Defense Forces. I want to explain something to my people and to the galaxy. We are asking why humanity will not help us. But I know why. And you should know too." He pulled up the classified documents on the screen behind him. "For 18 months, our government violated the mining agreement that humans worked so hard to create. We lied about our operations. We disguised military installations as research stations. We did exactly what we accused the Velcors of doing." He paused, letting that sink in. "Why should humanity help us? We dishonored their work. We used their mediation as a political tool while planning to do whatever we wanted anyway. We treated peace as a game." His voice grew stronger. "And we are not alone. 23 agreements across the galaxy were violated the same way. Species took human solutions and threw them away the moment it was convenient. Then we have the audacity to demand they save us from the consequences of our own dishonesty." Ren looked directly into the camera. "Humanity is not our parent. They are not required to fix our mistakes. Maybe they are silent because they are waiting to see if we are finally ready to be honest. With them, with each other, with ourselves." The broadcast ended. Ren was arrested 3 hours later for releasing classified information. But the damage, or perhaps the healing, had already begun. The Velcor government, facing their own documentation of violations, could not simply condemn Ren without looking hypocritical. Their response was careful, measured, and notably did not deny the accusations. Across the galaxy, other species whose violations had been exposed faced similar reckonings. Public pressure mounted. Protesters gathered on a dozen worlds. The message was consistent. We broke faith first. In the Threshold systems, the Crethean and Velcor fleet commanders watched Ren's broadcast from their respective flagships. Both had lost friends in the recent battle. Both were exhausted. Both knew the fight was becoming pointless. Commander Sa of the Crethean forces sent a direct, unencrypted message to Commander Vel of the Velcor fleet. "Did you watch the broadcast?" The response came after a long pause. "Yes." "Did your government really violate the agreement?" "Yes." "Did yours?" Another pause. "Yes." "Then what are we fighting for?" The conversation that followed was not elegant. There were no human mediators to smooth the rough edges, to find the perfect words, to bridge cultural misunderstandings. Both commanders were military officers, not diplomats. They were blunt, sometimes hostile, and frequently talked past each other. But they were honest. After 14 hours of brutal negotiation, they reached an agreement. Both fleets would withdraw to their original positions. A neutral zone would be established in the disputed territory. No mining by either side for 6 months, while a proper treaty was negotiated. Third-party monitoring by a neutral species, not humans. It was imperfect. It left many questions unanswered. It would probably need revision, but it was theirs. They had created it themselves, through their own painful effort. When the ceasefire was announced, both populations reacted with relief, not celebration exactly. The cost had been too high for that, but relief that the dying had stopped. In her office on Earth, Ambassador Park read the ceasefire terms carefully. Diplomat Choi Sang-woo stood nearby, waiting for her assessment. "It's clumsy," Park said finally. "They left loopholes. They did not address long-term resource allocation. This will probably break down in 3 months." "Should we offer assistance?" Choi asked. Park was quiet for a moment. "No. Let them learn from their mistakes. Let them revise it themselves when it breaks. That is how skills are built. We gave them solutions for 80 years. We need to let them develop the capability to create their own." She pulled up the data on other conflicts across the galaxy. Of the 7 major disputes that had erupted during the silence, 4 were now moving toward resolution. Different species negotiating directly, awkwardly, but genuinely. 3 conflicts remained active with no progress. Species were still dying, and no diplomatic breakthrough seemed imminent. "How long do we maintain the silence?" Choi asked quietly. "Until we see fundamental change, not just crisis management. Until they build systems that do not require us to function. Until they value honesty as much as they value peace. And if that takes years, if thousands more die?" Park's expression was pained. "Then we will carry that weight. Because the alternative is enabling another 80 years of false peace that collapses the moment we are not watching. We are not being cruel. We are refusing to be accomplices." That night, 39 civilizations jointly submitted a formal petition to the human homeworld. It was not a demand. It was a request. The petition acknowledged the violations of past agreements. It included formal apologies from governments that had broken faith. It proposed new verification systems, transparency requirements, and enforcement mechanisms. Most importantly, it included a phrase that had never appeared in galactic diplomacy before. "We ask not for your solutions, but for your partnership in learning to solve our own problems." Ambassador Park read the petition 3 times. Then she called an emergency meeting of the Human Diplomatic Corps. For the first time in 31 days, they needed to decide whether to speak again. Day 47 of the silence marked a transformation that no one had predicted. The galactic situation had stabilized, but it was a different kind of stability. 4 major conflicts had been resolved without human mediation. The solutions were imperfect, full of compromises that would need future revision. But they were authentic. Species had negotiated directly, faced each other honestly, and reached agreements they owned themselves. 3 conflicts remained active, but even these showed signs of change. Direct dialogue had begun, clumsy and prone to breakdown, but happening nonetheless. The economic recovery was beginning. Markets responded to reduced uncertainty. Trade routes reopened as species maintained the agreements they had created themselves. The difference was subtle but significant. They were honoring these agreements not because humans were watching, but because they had built them with their own effort. Ambassador Park stood before the full human diplomatic corps, 37 people who had maintained absolute silence for 47 days. On the table in front of her lay the petition from 39 civilizations. "They are asking us to return," she said quietly, "but not as we were. They are asking for partnership, not solutions. They are asking us to teach, not to fix. The question before us is whether this change is real or simply another performance." Elder Yoon Ji-won spoke from his seat. "I have reviewed the evidence. 31 governments have implemented structural reforms to their diplomatic processes, public reporting requirements, independent verification systems, transparency laws. These are not trivial changes." Diplomat Lee Hyun-woo added his analysis. "The agreements they have reached themselves, even the flawed ones, have higher compliance rates than the agreements we mediated for them. When people build something with their own hands, they are more likely to maintain it." The debate continued for hours. Evidence was presented from multiple sources. Some argued for maintaining the silence longer, to ensure the changes took deep root. Others pointed out that humanity's goal was never to punish, but to teach. Finally, Ambassador Park called for a vote. Should humanity return to diplomatic service under the new framework proposed in the petition? The vote was unanimous in favor. But the return would be different. Humanity would not resume its old role as the galaxy's mediators. That role had been part of the problem. Park spent 3 days composing humanity's response. Every word was chosen with care. This would set the tone for the next era of galactic diplomacy. On day 50, the Galactic Assembly convened. The chamber was packed. Representatives from all 47 species were present. The gallery seats, usually empty, were filled with observers from across the galaxy. The human delegation entered and took their seats. For the first time in 50 days, Ambassador Park stood to address the assembly. The silence that fell was absolute. "We return today," Park began, her voice calm and clear, "but we return changed, and we hope you have changed as well." She paused, letting her words settle across the vast chamber. 50 days ago, we withdrew from mediation, not in anger, not in judgment, but in clarity. We had realized something painful. Our efforts to help you find peace had become a tool that enabled dishonesty. Species used our mediation as theater while planning to violate the very agreements we worked to create. Uncomfortable shifting rippled through the assembly, but no one interrupted. "We failed you," Park continued, "not by withdrawing, but by making you dependent on us. For 80 years, we gave you solutions instead of teaching you to find your own. We became the voice you used instead of developing your own. We enabled a galaxy that could not function without human mediators." She gestured to the petition on her display. "You have asked us to return. We accept. But we will not return as we were. We will not be your mediators. We will be your partners. We will not give you solutions. We will teach you to create your own. Our goal is not to make ourselves necessary, but to make ourselves eventually unnecessary." Park outlined the new framework. Humanity would offer mediation training programs. Species in conflict would first attempt direct negotiation. If they reached an impasse, human facilitators would guide them, not solve for them. Violations of agreements would result in automatic withdrawal of human assistance until accountability was demonstrated. "We believe," Park said, "that you are capable of more than you have shown. These past 50 days proved it. You negotiated difficult agreements without us. You built systems to verify compliance. You held your leaders accountable for dishonesty. You showed that you can do this work yourselves." She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of representatives from species she had mediated for over the years. "We will walk beside you, not before you. We will support you, not carry you. And we will trust that you can build a peace that does not require human voices to maintain it." The response to her speech was mixed. Some species showed relief. Others showed uncertainty. But all showed respect. The first test of the new system came immediately. The Krethian and Velcor delegations requested human assistance with a new dispute arising from their ceasefire agreement. Border definitions were unclear. Both sides interpreted the terms differently. Diplomat Choi Sang-woo, designated as facilitator, met with both delegations. But he did not mediate. He asked questions. He helped them clarify their actual interests versus their stated positions. He pointed out assumptions that needed examination, but he offered no solutions. After 8 hours, the Krethian and Velcor representatives reached their own agreement. They modified 3 clauses, clarified 2 definitions, and established a joint review process. When they finished, both sides thanked Choi. But before they thanked him, they thanked each other. It was a small moment, but it signified everything that had changed. Over the following weeks, requests for mediation training flooded in. 12 civilizations wanted to develop their own diplomatic corps. They wanted to learn the skills humans had used for 80 years, skills of listening, of pattern recognition, of finding common ground across cultural divides. Ambassador Park approved the establishment of the Galactic Diplomatic Academy. It would be led by humans initially, but the goal was clear: train species to train others. Create a self-sustaining system that did not depend on any single species. Elder Yoon-ji Won volunteered to teach the first class. 23 students from 15 species gathered in a simple classroom on Earth. Yoon began with a question. "Why do you think mediation works?" The students offered various answers: because mediators are neutral, because they offer solutions, because they have authority. Yoon shook his head at each answer. "Mediation works," he said finally, "when both sides want to solve their problem more than they want to win their argument. Everything else is just technique. The technique we can teach you. The wanting to solve problems, that has to come from you." It was the beginning of something new. A galaxy learning to speak its own language of peace. Months later, Ambassador Park and Elder Yoon stood in an observation deck, watching ships from various species meeting at a neutral station. A new dispute was being negotiated. No humans were present. The species were handling it themselves, using the skills they had learned. "Do you think they will remember this lesson?" Yoon asked quietly. Park considered the question. "Some will forget. Habits are hard to break, but they will remember what happened when they forgot, and now they have the tools to correct themselves. That is all we can give them." They watched the diplomatic ships in silence for a while. "We taught them to need us," Park said finally. "The silence taught them they could survive without us. Now we are teaching them to thrive without us. Perhaps that is the greatest gift one species can give another." Yoon smiled. "To love them enough to let them stand on their own. Even when they stumble. Especially when they stumble." Below them, the negotiations continued. Imperfect, messy, but real. The galaxy had learned that peace without accountability was merely postponed war. They had learned it because humanity loved them enough to be silent, when silence was the only truth that remained. The breath the galaxy had held for 47 days had been exhaled, and in breathing again, they had found their own voice, not a perfect voice. Not always a peaceful voice, but an honest one. And that, Ambassador Park thought as she watched the stars, was worth the cost of silence.